called Marion Hoff, and I lived in Plymouth until I was married and came to Buckfordsley in 1953. I can remember the announcement of the Second World War on the radio, or the wireless as it was known as then, because of course there were no televisions. I was 11 years old at the time, and I had just finished my first year in secondary school, which was Stoke Dartmoor High School in Devonport. After the war was announced, our school was taken over as a hospital. So for the second year, we had to share a school with Devonport High School, which was in the Beacon Park area. And we went, one week we went to mornings for school, and next week we went afternoons. And that continued for the whole of that year. Then for the next year, our school took over a large house, and we began lessons there. So I was having a very disrupted education at that time. Then in 1941, the air raids began. And it was in February 1941 that Plymouth had its first raid, which was just, I think, a single bomber returning from a raid in Cardiff and dropped some bombs in the Stoke area of Plymouth, which was quite near where I lived. And it was a month after that, in March, and the King and Queen had been visiting Plymouth that day, March the 20th, and had only just left the city a couple of hours before when Plymouth had its first proper air raid and the city centre was bombed. What used to happen, there were pathfinders that would come in and drop hundreds of incendiary bombs to light up the area, and then the heavy bombers would come in and drop their bombs. A month after that, in April, the raids began in Devonport, which was the area in which I lived, because we lived near the Royal Naval Barracks and also the dockyard, and of course these were prime areas for bombing. Most of the raids were at night, and I lived in a terraced house. There were several terraces parallel to one another, and because we only had a very small garden, we didn't have one of the Anderson shelters which were issued, but we preferred to go to an underground shelter which was made underneath a park about 200 yards from where I lived. So in the night, when the sirens started, we'd have to jump out of bed and throw on some clothes and run up the street and into the air raid shelter. I can remember, I was about 13 or 14 then, I can remember putting on some navy trousers and a little red top which my mother had made for me with a hood. That was my little siren suit. And because there wasn't very much time, we prepared flasks of coffee or tea or whatever in the evenings in case we had to do this, and we ran as fast as we could up to the shelter, and we always sat in the same place. There were sort of little tunnels, and it was all very stark and cold, but everybody seemed to go into the same seats, so we always sat with the same people, and had our hot drinks and talked and slept until the all clear sounded, which was usually perhaps a couple of hours later. And the sounds you could hear were some of the ack-ack fire, because searchlights would be panning the sky to try and pick out the bombers, and when they did find one in the searchlight, of course then the ack-ack fire would start. But it was the bombs that were terrifying. You could hear a loud whistle, and then you didn't know where it was going to fall until you heard an explosion, and if it happened to be fairly near, you could perhaps hear, you know, a shudder as well.